There once was a man who loved the outdoors. He enjoyed skiing, sailing, and hiking. He favored French cuisine, good white wine, and gourmet cooking, especially a good steak. He listened to Mozart and watched obscure foreign films. He had a passion for plants. He sought the finer things in life. He cherished the family he came from and looked forward to forming his own. He was popular with women. He knew exactly when to send flowers and sentimental cards. His poems of love were tender and romantic. To many, he was a brilliant man, a student of intellectual pursuits and distinction. He was articulate, cultured, and stylish, but also polite, sarcastic, and down-to-earth. There were some odd things about him, too. He liked to collect socks, usually skipped lunch, and always had a fake mustache on him, which he liked to try on at times to play pranks and look cool. This was the 70s, bear with me. But there was something else. Something not so whimsical about this man. He stole, conned, tortured, stalked, assaulted, and killed no less than 30 young women in at least 5 different states. Unseen under everybody's nose. His, like everything about him, seemed sharp but unremarkable. Ted Bundy was this and many other things, some which you may have never known, but that we will discover. More than anything, it's time we bury the myth and get to the point. Ted Bundy was a bastard. It's a story done to death, you say? Well, I think some people deserve to roll in their grave. Together, we'll explore the life and deaths of one of the world's most notorious and overhyped, yes, our society is problematic, serial killers of recent memory. But we won't take the easy route. We will travel in time, leaving no stone unturned, no suspicious element discarded of, no theory fully unexplored, and no myth unbusted. Because, you see, there are many. In The Bastard, we'll give a voice and an identity to the victims of crimes that are too often just smiling portraits without a story. We will have everyone heard, and you will decide who to believe. No one will be spared, and too many already deceived. I have compiled and combed through years of research made by skilled detectives, psychiatrists, attorneys, archivists, witnesses, prison buddies, and FBI agents, and there is no doubt I could have been deceived myself. That's what happens when you listen to the words of a bastard. It's not exactly a term of endearment like lady killer or deliberate stranger. We won't make this pretty. We won't employ any fancy narrative devices like jumping through time or creepy sound effects. At most, I can stick some music in here to make this more atmospheric. But it's the story, told with fascinating, excruciating, overlooked new details that will allow us to truly piece everything back together. A story where there are no real coincidences. And no, it's not a pretty picture. But he knew that too. He said,
"I'm far from a genius. People use the terribly bright, terribly handsome thing as part of the image process. I'm not exceptionally handsome. I'm not exceptionally bright. I may not even be bright by some people's definition, or handsome for that matter, but it's a part of creating the myth of Ted Bundy, which is separate and distinct from my reality. But that's not to say that I'm so special that no one can understand me, or that nobody has the capacity to understand me."
This is as close as we can get to unraveling this rat bastard's nest, his reality, from crime scene analysis to psychological speculations and other radioactive facts. Put that hazmat suit on, it's time to shine a light on some of the muddy concrete in these sewers. I guess I should say enter the mind of the monster, since that's the idea, but that one's been done to death too. We'll take Ted's own advice.
Try to consolidate it then. Give the substance in a different order. If you took it from a chronological viewpoint, from when he first began to describe his life, and leading up to the part where he got into trouble from the law.
No, Ted Bundy did not know how to use conjunctions, if you were wondering. But that's what I'm here for. This is The Bastard, the life and deaths of Ted Bundy. Disclaimer. As you can imagine, in this series we'll touch upon some uncomfortable topics. We have attempted to keep the chronicle of the events as faithful to detail as possible, and as such, censorship is besides our issues. Where the truth lies is hard if not impossible to tell, but we have built a map to make our way into a strange land of rocky mountains, of facts, and deep oceans of speculation. We'll be sure to tell you what is fact and what may be fiction. All references and source material used for The Bastard is listed on its official microsite and show notes. This is an independently produced podcast. I'm Val Rocha, and now without further ado, let's begin our story just after World War II. There was a general feeling of jubilation in the air that lasted like an extended honeymoon. The year is 1946. The United States is just beginning its famous path to become the land of wonder that it will be in the next decade. And most people are breathing sighs of relief as their loved ones return from the war. Little does she know, Louise Cowell, a 22-year-old department store clerk, will soon meet one of them. Louise is the eldest of 3 daughters, middle sister Audrey and little Julia, who is 10 years her junior. Prudish and secretive, she is difficult to get close to, even by her own family standards. And despite her undemonstrative behavior, she has a bit of a temper. By all accounts, however, she's well liked in the community of equally quiet Roxborough, Philadelphia. She's the president of the Young People's Group at her Methodist church, an attractive woman of delicate features and apparent sensitivity to people's feelings. It's her own that she keeps tightly controlled. Her youngest sister, Julia, on the other hand, is a budding free spirit who longs to become an artist someday. She is berated by the other Cowells for being too open and trusting and constantly compared to Louise, the model to emulate. Up until one night, when, at the age of 12, Julia hears a faint, whispered conversation that culminates with her older sister packing a suitcase and mysteriously leaving the next day. Julia puts 2 and 2 together and assumes Louise has gotten herself pregnant. This comes as a shock. Her sister had been extremely successful in high school and had high hopes for her future after graduation. Sure, she felt a little resentful over losing the only college scholarship available to a richer girl in her class, knowing she wouldn't have been able to afford going otherwise, but she had chugged along, as she always did. Perhaps this is what fueled her desire for a night of abandon to let herself go. But that came with a price that's growing inside of her now, and her belly is starting to show. The members of her much-beloved church group who had seen her at a conference the previous weekend certainly noticed. Having a baby out of wedlock in 1946 isn't the exemplary Christian behavior that their young president should engage in. So, after ostracizing and condemning her, they request for her to leave. Losing the support of her only social outlet sends her in a tailspin. Might as well leave the state altogether, rather than face the humiliation of giving birth there. Her parents, also surprised and saddened by the news, tell her abortion is out of the question. An alternative arrangement must be made to preserve Louise's good name. So, around September, Louise, almost 7 months pregnant, is then sent to the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers in Burlington, Vermont, nicknamed Lizzie Lund's Home for Naughty Ladies. Despite her shattered reputation, she still has the local Methodist minister's wife sitting by her side in the car, so she doesn't have to make the trip alone. Once she arrives, Louise tries to make herself at home, so to speak. She never says more than she has to, and much of what takes place over her 2-month stay will be a secret forever. Even years later, the home will refuse to release several reports and records of Louise's time there, at her request no less. We do know that she adamantly defended her church group and never blamed them for making her leave. They did what they had to do. How could she so passively put up with that? She had a family, siblings, money, resources. Many of the women in the shelter have a hard time accepting her when she speaks about her experience in her life back in Philadelphia. Only a few of them, the most confident and stable-minded, don't feel she's above them in some way when she relates her experiences. This, as time will tell, is not too dissimilar to what will once be said about her progeny. Approximately 2 months later, on November 24, said progeny is born with no complications at the home. Louise names him Theodore Robert Cowell, but everyone calls him Ted. Judging by Ted's birth date, we can assume the fateful encounter between Louise and the father took place at some point that winter. Perhaps it was on a late Friday night, around Valentine's Day, when for once she didn't want to be alone and felt the need to be held in a man's arms. But the identity of this man will be concealed for the rest of Louise and her son's life. this will have a detrimental effect on Ted. Secrecy, a recurring theme in the Cowell and later Bundy house, has the unintended consequence of turning family members into strangers. But let's amuse ourselves with some possible theories as to who this man is. Ted's dad could have been Jack Worthington, also known as Lloyd Marshall, a rakish veteran of the recent war. Records would later confirm that a Jack Worthington with an unlisted telephone number who had lived in Philadelphia did exist. He was a Penn State or UPenn graduate, accounts vary, and Air Force veteran salesman or sailor, again, accounts vary. The most elaborate of all the stories about Mr. Mystery, another nickname that will be attributed to his progeny someday, was that Louise had met him through a friend at work at the department store, a friend whose name she could never recall. In just 2 weeks, this man managed to seduce and abandon her, disappearing into thin air. In an effort to trace him at some point, Louise did call the university, but no one had ever enrolled under either the Worthington or Marshall name. It's just too bad she couldn't remember her friend's name now, is it? Another story involves him being an older married member of the church that had a one-night stand with Louise at a religious retreat. Considering how much he valued her group and readily accepted to be shooed out, this isn't that out of the realm of possibility either. The rest of the Cowell family, though, maintains these stories are, well, bogus. As a matter of fact, Ted's birth certificate would only contain the word unknown under the father's name. This is only the first of many mysteries that will permeate our story. Sorry to drop one so soon. When later asked about it by psychologists, they'd report Ted would show marked signs of hostility when asked about his father's whereabouts, simply adding,
"You might say that he left my mother and me and never rejoined the family."
Unable to contain a little emotion leaking from his features. Perhaps the first hallmarks of an inner monster revealed. Whether Ted ever intended on finding his identity is unclear. He'd go on to state this incident was no big deal, but as you'll come to learn, Ted's actions will indicate otherwise. And words too, for that matter. He contradicts himself all the time. Back in 1946, a few days after giving birth to him, Louise leaves Vermont, alone. No baby or minister's wife to hold her hand this time. Presumably her little Ted is to be adopted. He seems to receive sufficient care to sustain good health and is a normal, wonderful baby. Who wouldn't want him? Well, apparently many people. Ted would remain at the home for around 3 months, in the care of a number of nurses but no single mother. One of the many theories that will later attempt to explain Ted's complex psychology is that this period as a lone newborn left him with reactive attachment disorder, aka RAD, a definitely not so rad condition. Sorry about that, I just couldn't resist there. The idea is that because he doesn't form strong emotional bonds with his primary caretakers, being passed around from nurse to nurse, counting down the minutes till the shift's end, this eventually hinders his ability to show the same care to others later on in life, and relating to them will always take an extra conscious effort. Three months later, in February 1947, Samuel Sam F. Cowell, Louise's father, a church deacon and passionate landscape gardener who owns his own greenhouse, insists she takes Ted back home to middle-class rural Roxborough. So she promptly obeys and takes the newborn back to Philadelphia. The Cowell house is located on Domino Lane, an area that is rural and isolated. It is part of a farmhouse for a 67-acre farm at the site, situated on unpaved, gravel-filled lanes. Louise would later find herself speculating on what could have happened if she'd let him get adopted. Would she have felt awful? Probably. In hindsight, she'll come to doubt her decision. Maybe she shouldn't have gotten him back. But there was no point going over that now. Whatever will be is already set in stone. She could just do as she was told. To salvage her reputation, Ted is raised as Sam and Grandma Eleanor Cowell's child, with Louise acting as his sister. This is a bit of an open secret, as the whole town seems to be aware of the scheme. Even Ted himself suspects he has been living a kind of lie since the very beginning of his life, and would occasionally slip, calling Louise Mom.
I knew. Don't ask me how I knew. Maybe I heard conversations. Maybe I just figured out that there couldn't be 20 years' difference in age between a brother and a sister, and Louise always took care of me. I just grew up thinking she was really my mother.
Louise would later deny the story. "I'm not so sure where that came from. I'm not sure Ted ever said that," she'd say. I guess we know where the compartmentalization comes from. I'll explain that one later. Grandpa Sam's sister, the feisty and articulate Virginia Bristol, better known as Ginny, Ted's great aunt, is immediately skeptical of his adoption, especially following Louise's unexplained departure and surreptitious return. Her brother is too old to have a baby with fragile Eleanor, his undoubtedly ideal, timid, obedient, God-fearing wife. Except for one thing, she's very sick. Eleanor Cowell is said to suffer from manic depression, what we call bipolar disorder today. Despite her episodes of bedridden meekness, she would also occasionally be chastised for talking too much and being unable to stop. She is subjected to 40s electroshock therapy, which sounds nightmarish on its own, but it's also not really the recommended form of treatment for the disease, and doesn't do much to help her. By the time Ted was brought back home, Eleanor is too anxious to leave the house for any occasion at all and begins to suffer from agoraphobia, a condition that worsened as she got older. Whatever the situation is, baby Ted grows up receiving a lot of attention from his aunts Audrey and Julia, who fuss over him when Louise is out working or trying to make her way back into the church group. Ted also develops a particular close attachment to the current only male figure in the household, his grandfather Sam. Ted loves his highly educated and loving grandpa and looks up to his green thumb, his interests in literature and science, and his business skills. He spends countless hours with him in the greenhouse, where Sam shows him how to nurture delicate alpine plants. It was the greenhouse that would later become one of Ted's favorite hideaways. It is no coincidence that years later he'd develop a passion for plants himself, though he'd acquire his without planting a single seed. According to members of the Roxborough Garden Club, Sam is helpful and pleasant. He'd started attending when the club reopened after World War II, had to offset its monthly meetings, and he made sure not to miss a single one. He's extremely knowledgeable in the area of shrubs and plants, especially roses, and would go on to head landscaping plans for the local YMCA that had been previously filled with dirt and debris. President Marie Kaufman recalls Sam as a very gentle country-type style person, who she thought bore a striking resemblance to Abraham Lincoln, minus the beard. He's the first one she calls for information if she has doubts on any gardening or landscaping issues. Eventually, Sam would even start holding his own classes in flower arranging at the meetings. To Aunt Audie, Sam is also a nice man, generous and selfless, a person who dedicates much of his time helping others. She distinctly remembers him tending to the dogwood in her yard, a special gift he'd planted just for her. He never drinks and teaches Sunday school at the First Congregational Church in Germantown, Philadelphia, founded by Eleanor's father. He also served as a deacon, as a trustee, as a Boy Scout leader, and took the Sunday school class members to swim at the YMCA that he'd helped restore. But, as you may know, to others, the home run by Sam Cowell is remembered very differently, as a supposedly fearful place, allegedly ran by a man that several other family members at one point were called as borderline insane. Because of his standing in the community, Sam is very concerned with his and his family's image. This means that ever mentioning or talking about Louise's situation is a big no-no. Whenever anyone brings it up, he gets enraged and acts like a wild, furious madman. Ted's cousin, John Cowell, remembers these outbursts vividly whenever he'd asked about Ted's paternity. This reaction is so unusual that it would later lead to a widespread rumor that Sam was Ted's father, meaning Louise's son was the product of an incestuous relationship. This would be later disproven by DNA testing. It is likely that Sam's wrath is a result of the shame Louise's pregnancy brings upon the household, or perhaps more sinisterly, jealousy over Louise's attentions. But Sam is also violent in other occasions, so much so that he's characterized as a manically deranged, plagued by volatility and the tendency to throw temper tantrums that terrorize the household. Young Julia in particular never looks forward to him coming home because that means that some loud shouting is just around the corner. She has the habit of occasionally sleeping in until 9 o'clock, which reportedly angers him to no end. One time, when his patience finally gives out, he yanks her out of bed so hard that she stumbles down a 3-step landing. She maintains, however, that this is the only time that he ever touched her, and that he never actually threw her down a flight of stairs, contrary to what you might have heard. He's a verbal tyrant, for the most part. Most because, as everyone in the household knows, Sam isn't shy about hitting his wife Eleanor. Some suspect he might be schizophrenic. His sister Ginny has told the family doctor she thinks him crazy, just like his wife, but in a different way. The man would spend days talking to unseen presences, shouting, ranting, and raving at them or nothing in particular. Sometimes he gets so mad he starts jumping up and down for no discernible reason. His brothers fear him and wish someone would kill him. At times, they contemplate doing it themselves. But his wrath is not limited to family members. His greenhouse employees also fall victim to his fury, unleashed in aggressive admonishments if they happen to dig up the wrong shrub. It's not limited to humans at all. Sam had once grabbed a cat that dared come near him, swinging it and spinning it by the tail, and occasionally kicking the family dogs until they hauled in pain to his amusement. He has bizarre paranoias and unexplained hatred towards blacks, Italians, Catholics, and Jews, though I suppose this wasn't crazy at the time. To Louise, none of this was particularly crazy or frightening. Sam would mellow out as he got older, even when he could still get awfully mad and yell out. However warped family life is, it is all Ted knows. He'd go on to identify, respect, and cling on to his grandfather, longing to impress him with prestigious accolades that would help prove his worth and set him apart from the average Cowell. He'd never talk about Grandpa Sam with anything less than admiration. So, is any of what was rumored to have taken place true? Years later, Aunt Audrey would take it upon herself to debunk several claims that challenged Sam's reputation after Ted's infamy preceded the family. For starters, her mother Eleanor was not manic depressive, Audrey claimed. Instead, she suffered from diabetes, which was not the easiest condition to deal with in the late 40s. She'd also later have a stroke, which would take time and endless resources for her to recover from. Most importantly, though, she'd go on to state without hesitation that while Sam could have a temper and could be feisty, he was never violent, never spanked any of the children, never mistreated any pets, and was a rather gentle man who loved Ted very much. In fact, Sam and Eleanor had been very supportive of Louise's pregnancy. No one at home was frightened of Grandpa Sam, and neither were his employees. Sam's friend, John Lawfridge, would echo Audrey's sentiments. All he knew of Sam was that he was a religious, strong, and loving family man with an exceptional work ethic. So exceptional, in fact, that some of his employees stuck by his side for over 35 years. Whether Ted himself endures or witnesses some of this alleged abuse and is able to simply block it out, or just lies about it, or never sees any of it at all, or if it just simply didn't happen, is just another one of those mysteries in our story. I'll let you decide. It won't be the first conflicting account we'll hear. Brace yourself, there are many. If that's what happened, it marks the beginning of little Ted's ability to dissociate himself from his chaotic environment, shutting out the events happening around him and pushing him on an early development of his fractured personality. He'll drift through these states, which will become common only later in life, once perceived just as volatile moods, like the ones that most of us have. But instead of flowing freely and naturally, his will assume a character of their own, independent from each other. Even his conflicted knowledge of his paternity hints at a possibility of living in a duplicitous reality, one where his mother is his sister and his grandfather is his savior, and his fear is exciting and control is love. And things were bound to get complicated after that. Aunt Julia, who is now 15, is noticing some weird behaviors from her young nephew. He's developing a particular fascination with sleep and unconsciousness. It's the defenselessness in the face of danger that he finds strangely intriguing. Once or twice, Julia wakes up to find 3-year-old Ted placing kitchen knives in her bed. He stands by her side, looking dazed, grinning with a glint in his eye, which you may recognize from the many pictures of him we'd see years later. The infamous Ted Bundy stare would become somewhat of a trademark in its vaguely unsettling quality. It would haunt many that would come to know him. For years, Julia is the only one who would think this is strange. When she tells her family, the rest of the Cowells don't react. A reason for this is because, well, it may not have gone exactly this way. Audrey took it upon herself again to debunk this claim too, adding that Julia would have later regretting disclosing the incident. Her explanation for it, she'd later tell the Roxborough Review, was this. The youngster happened to be in a rambunctious mood and deposited a number of things from a kitchen cabinet drawer upon her bed, including an egg beater. There was nothing sinister involved. It was completely twisted. But the adage remains. If nothing is ever said, it could be, effectively, as if it never happened. It would recede to an abstract plane of pseudo-existence, a dream, a past that was untouchable and only existed in the mysterious mists of the unknown and the unreal. As unreal as Ted's father's identity. At this time, Louise repeatedly attempts to contact Mr. Mystery Sr. She needs financial help to raise Ted, but he refuses to come around. The truth is, he's simply not interested in Louise or their son. The Cowells in the coming years would come to believe that he was the reason behind Ted's more peculiar behaviors. Because he didn't exist in their lives, that's plausible. He could be as real as a ghost, the unknown lingering in Ted's birth certificate. So who's to say that what he finds in the greenhouse is real either? Story has it that Ted, at just 4, sneaks into Sam's haven with cousin Bruce and secretly peruses his grandpa's stash of pornography. His safe place would now incorporate a whole new dimension for comfort. Images of scantily clad women become part of it. It is no wonder it would become such a tormenting part of his life. And I am saying if, because once again, according to Aunt Audrey in 1951, when Ted would have been 4, there were no cousins living at the Domino Lane Cowell house. Her son, Bruce, would only be born years later. We also don't know what kind of pornography Grandpa Sam has stashed, and just how kinky it is. Because of the later turn Ted's life will take, we can assume it wasn't exactly the same kind of porn we think of today. Typical porn in the 1950s could mean violent and erotic fiction, photos and graphic descriptions of murder and other death-related subjects, crime scene photos, autopsies, as well as videos and images of what would be today's hard pornography equivalent, meaning graphic depictions of sex. It wasn't just sex. Pornography was understood as anything that holds no socially redeeming value. Holding on to these kinds of materials is highly taboo, and society shuns those who show interest in it, especially if they're church deacons. Ted will quickly come to learn that, but the risk is worth taking. It is his gateway into the thrill and excitement that life lacks. If Ted became sexually aroused at this young age, even if he just understood what he was looking at, the seeds were already planted for his later sexual interests. No pun intended. Coupled with his preoccupation for the submissive body, he'd grow fond of the idea of control. In fact, control would later become perhaps the most considerable preoccupation in his life. Great Aunt Ginny feels the need to rescue Louise and her little Teddy. She can't suspect what goes on in the greenhouse, but sees real problems on the horizon. The environment seems particularly unhealthy for her niece, who is stuck at home, unable to go to the church she'd been exiled from, and who works for her moody dad and can't find other employment. She has virtually no chance to socialize or get to know anyone, which by implication means she'll never be married. So it's time for Louise to revisit this moving idea.
In the nation's northwest corner is Washington, an evergreen playground blessed by an unusual variety of natural attractions. Hundreds of rivers and streams flow through broad valleys of western Washington.
In 1951, Louise and Ted Nelson moved to Tacoma, Washington. She initiated their new adventure with a name change. With a brand new name, she could pass herself for a widow or a divorcee and give Ted an equally unreal and unknown dad to live with Uncle Jack R. Cowell, Grandpa Sam's brother. He's a music professor whom Ted describes as a warm, thoughtful, well-educated man of accomplishment and refinement. A man who knew about life. Ted would go on to attempt to emulate and pattern his life around his. In turn, Jack would go on to pattern some of his time after Ted, occasionally working with delinquent children eventually. Perhaps it was a result of his relationship with Uncle Jack that Ted would go on to develop the love for classical music that seems to affect a lot of serial killers. Like, isn't that weird? He also liked his aunt, Eleanor, not to be confused with his homebound grandmother. This Eleanor came from a wealthy family, and despite also being a frail woman of seemingly ill health, she is very intelligent and refined, which makes Ted feel close to her. He'd grow jealous of his cousin John Cowell, who was set to go on to school in Paris, own a mansion, and ride a Rolls Royce. To Ted, John is bigger, stronger, and remarkably spoiled. He enjoys challenging him in friendly wrestles, but he can never beat him. It's a constant competition. According to Ted, later on, their relationship improved and they became like brothers. Just as Ted is growing fond of his new life across the country, Louise takes it away from him. That is to say, she starts making enough to support her small family and move into an apartment of their own. She's returned to friendly turf, working as a secretary at the Council of Churches. Ted immediately misses being surrounded by attentive family members. He has already suffered as a result of leaving his grandfather dad, and now this fracturing of the nuclear family as he saw it made the world a confusing, threatening place. He'd often go back to visit Uncle Jack and playfully ask him to be adopted, much to Louise's disappointment. He feels that Puget Sound is below his tastes. Life is not as sweet as Philadelphia. Ted never quite understood the need for the move. A budding resentment towards Louise for having prioritized herself in his eyes begins to form. Later Freudians would say Ted longed to channel his repressed rage against the symbolic image of his mother for her promiscuous infidelity, put in less polite terms by Grandpa Sam in moments of anger, which I'll leave you to imagine. Ted feels rootless in Washington, and clinging to Sam's beliefs gives him a semblance of belonging. As he enters the buzzing, baffling world of kindergarten, he has a couple of regular buddies amongst the cousins which ease him into not feeling like such an outcast. But solace is around the corner, at least for Louise. Just a few weeks later, a female co-worker invites her to attend a Methodist church adult night singles dance, and she meets Johnny Culpepper Bundy. He's a tiny, short, mustard-out Navy man who works at the Madigan Army Hospital as a cook and is a little shy but kind and solid. Maybe kind of slow. But their relationship moves along very fast. In a few months, they settle into a small house in an Italian Catholic neighborhood with pigs and chickens, and as you may know from American Psycho...
Did you know that Ted Bundy's first dog, a collie, was named Lassie? Had you heard this?
By May 19 of that year, 27-year-old Louise and 29-year-old Johnny are married. Ted sticks a hand in the wedding cake. Johnny adopts Ted, and he officially becomes Theodore Robert Bundy. Ted would never ask his mother about the other man, in Louise's words, his father, because he'd never heard or seen anything about him. As far as she was concerned, Ted was perfectly content to call Johnny Bundy Dad. But in reality, Ted felt alone. He is now no longer the sole object of his mother's affection, and adding to all the secrecy surrounding his birth, the 3 months he'd spent alone in the home in Vermont and the loss of his beloved grandpa led him to one conclusion: he's actually unwanted. This worsens by summertime when Louise miscarries a child. This incident scars Ted, who, unable to understand the specifics of pregnancy, assumes it's been Daddy Johnny who caused his mother so much pain. The troubled relationship with his stepfather is already clouded by shades of mistrust and contempt. Routine is attempted as a remedy. That September, Ted starts elementary school at Sherman Elementary and attends church every Sunday. Ted will spend literal years studying the Bible, but will retain next to nothing by the time he makes it to college. It works for some time, though. The following year, Louise and Johnny bear their first child, and Ted has a little sister, Linda. But once again, Ted believes that Louise suffers a lot as a result of his birth and blames it on Johnny. According to Ted, Linda and none other of Ted's future siblings would be told about his illegitimacy. At some point this year, Ted suffers an accident and is hit on the head with a 2x4 board. This incident would lead to the formation of a lifelong scar on his head and potentially have more devastating consequences depending on who you believe. To accommodate the new additions to the family, the Bundys moved to the more suburban community of Brownsport in Tacoma shortly thereafter. But there aren't many kids in the neighborhood, and Ted spends most of his time playing with Lassie. His parents attempt to set boundaries by forbidding him to climb into their bed when he's frightened at night. He's scared by the fierce Italian kids who run around the block and makes quite an effort to hide away from them. A trace of Grandpa Sam's own ideology seems to linger. By now, signs of his own temper are starting to show. When a teacher breaks a ruler over his knuckles for having socked a classmate in the nose during a scuffle. He later claims this was the only time he hit a man, that it was the kid who forced him, and that he felt terrible afterwards, disgusted with himself. This is one of the many first and only times we'll later hear Ted say that he ever hit somebody. Once again, Ted is excluded by virtually everyone around him, causing him to retreat in his world more and more. In fact, it's around this time that Ted begins to feel a vague sense of uneasiness within himself, a fear, a doubt. The latent aggression starts possibly as a result of this deep self-doubt and belief that life had wronged him. According to Ted himself, it was
both the resulting uneasiness and the congenital predisposition
genes, supposedly,
that lead to the development of his continuing interest in fantasy.
Still, at 6 years old, he doesn't notice or identify that his condition is a serious problem or that it will eventually become one. He seems to find solace in his next teacher, but is quickly unsettled when, once again, she becomes pregnant and a scowling substitute who is nowhere near as pleasant is hired to lead the class. This theme of pregnancy seemingly diverting the attention of women, which he craves, repeats itself once again. And while he learns to love the sub, something goes unresolved. Anyone who, in Ted's eyes, shows him any attention, for whatever reason, ends up leaving. A picture of a relatively troubled development begins to form. As the old cliché tells us, many future antisocial individuals have a lot in common, like the usual struggles with self-worth, family relations, friendships, societal expectations, authority figures, and eventually, sex and sexual partners. A disappointing reality is cause for continued frustration, which, in due time, may transform itself into repressed anger. In his book Signature Killers, former detective and PhD Robert Keppel, we'll meet him later, postulates the conditions for underlying clinical anger that develops within. It's a condition that erodes the personality gradually. Clinical anger is totally abnormal, that is to say, rationally unfounded. Because of that, it remains constant, dormant, under the surface and not situational or transient. It is something that is beyond the individual's control, so much so that he will eventually learn to treat it as a separate entity. Spoiler alert. It's never quite intentionally understood. People with these conditions go on their entire lives attempting to get to their why, but usually fail to do so. Further resentment with the psychologists or professionals who seek to aid in this purpose eventually develops. And so the anger increases, developing exponentially as the child develops and changes through puberty and eventually adulthood. It is this anger that becomes the main motivation for the search of a fantasy world. A release that is initially internal but eventually will become the catalyst for antisocial and deviant behavior. Surrogate representatives are usually the victims of this clinical anger, people who, under some abstract framework, represent the source of the initial hostility. It is only by acting out, and we'll learn plenty about what that means, that a sense of relief from the constant pressure from the underlying rage is felt, but it's only temporary. Eventually, a full sense of satisfaction and enhancement in the fulfillment of the fantasies in the real world will be regulated and perhaps even stimulated by the use of external aids, alcohol, drugs, pornography, or viewing other violent acts. Inspiration seeking, if you will. And it will only be a matter of time before the person develops a pattern of behavior through their life as a matter of stabilizing themselves and coping with their inner turmoil. And as we will see through the course of our journey, it is this path that young Ted is on, and the signs are just starting to show. At age 7, Ted finally makes some friends in the neighborhood, Doug Holt and his sister Sandy Holt. Now, Sandy Holt has recently participated in her fair share of Ted Bundy documentaries, one in which she suggests Ted is undoubtedly the product of incest, which we already know to be untrue, so take her alleged stories with a little grain of salt. We're including them, as Ted would say, for posterity. According to her, Ted had already developed a liking for scaring people at this early age. She saw Ted use a pocket knife to cut open animals, douse them with gasoline, and set them on fire. Ted and her brother Doug also used knives to slash the leather seats of cars. They liked to build tiger traps, which were a bit of pointed stakes disguised with vegetation. Sandy said,
"One little girl went over the top of one of Ted's tiger traps and got the whole side of her leg slit open with the sharpened point of the stick that she landed on."
Ted also tried to pants young girls, that is, to lure them into the woods, pull down their pants, and urinate on them. I know that was an extra step than the usual pantsing that we know about. Luckily, when it was Sandy who Ted tried to drag into the woods, her brother Doug would hit him to make him stop. By this point, Ted develops some kind of speech impediment, which makes him the object of much ridicule amongst his peers. To remedy his growing unpopularity and better integrate him, his stepfather Johnny has Ted join the Boy Scouts, of whom he's the leader. Later on, Ted would abruptly stop attending and find excuses not to go. Sandy Holt claims she knows why. A rumor has it that during one of the Scouts' excursions, the Holt's father and Ted are discovered naked together in a tent in the middle of the day. His son Doug believed that something kinky had happened. The fathers of a fellow scout berated Mr. Holt, who has been accused by Sandy to have sexually abused her and her brother throughout their childhood as well. Following this alleged incident, Ted has more scuffles with the scouts. He hits one of them, John Moon, in the head with a stick from behind. Again, the first time and only time he ever hit a man. And shoves a plate in another boy's face for having hatched a tree. Again, for the first and only time he ever hit a man. This is the first time. Sorry. Or third. Or fourth? What are we? Third time. In February, his brother Glenn is born, and the family moves once more to a small box house on the west side, where more kids lived and there were newer and closer recreation facilities. Right after them, a black family happens to move into the neighborhood. Upset over Johnny's racially motivated concern on the impact of an African-American family on property values of the area, a defiant Ted befriends the children just to spite him. He grows quite confident in his ability to make friends and becomes tight with Terry Storick, who lives down the block, and Warren Dodge, who shares a birthday with him. The three of them do everything together while growing up, from playing around the streets to later on trying their first cigarettes. Terry Storwick in particular would also get a glimpse of Ted's unpredictable temper. While his friend does his best to keep himself separate from situations, when the occasional fight erupts, he changes. Storwick remembers Ted's eyes turning black when he got angry, and he wouldn't be the only one. Report cards from around this time would encourage Ted to develop a respectful and cooperative attitude toward the other pupils. And by the age of 8, it's not only the other kids he has a problem with. His relationship with his stepfather is also on the rocks and seems to take an odd turn. He'd later say about it,
Johnny was extremely busy digging, gardening, rebuilding. He couldn't sit down. The primary contact with my father was him directing and telling me things I should be doing.
Despite his mild nature, Johnny occasionally uses corporal punishment with Ted and takes on hitting him with a belt, sometimes in front of Dodge and Storick. According to Dodge, who admittedly never claimed to know the Bundy family too well, Johnny is a strict yet weak father figure, not much of one in fact. It is Louise who is primarily responsible for raising the kids. According to Storwick, who was better acquainted with the clan, Louise loved Ted very much. According to Ted, their relationship remained superficial. Nonetheless, Louise attempts to protect Ted from Johnny's belt, acting as a mediator between the two of them and making it a point to never yell or use any kind of force with their son. Instead, she supports his budding desires to become a policeman or lawyer. Okay. On one occasion, Ted, jealous of Louise and longing for her attention, stages a scene where he dramatically wets himself in a Sears parking lot, potentially as a result of Johnny's berating. He'd go on to frequently attempt to pit the two parents against each other. He likes to feel the power to be able to control people and see them acting at his mercy. One of the best ways to do this is through his witty use of words. Ted would learn to use verbal quips to fight with Johnny, talking him into holes in the ground which would test his patience so much so that the only way he knew to respond was with violence. It is interesting to note that Ted would go on to remember Johnny Bundy's harsh discipline and, in a way, condemn him for it, while continuing to idolize Grandpa Sam. Could it really be possible that Ted never witnessed the extent of Sam's abuse? Or was it that Sam, being his blood, his original dad, if you will, was excused from criticism? We'll never really know. The main father-son activities consist of picking beans and berries in several fields to earn extra money for the family. Ted and Johnny are able to get over their conflicts only by helping the family to obtain what they both truly care about: material resources. To escape his mundane life, Ted begins listening to a variety of radio shows. Among his favorites are Lone Ranger, which chronicled the adventures of a masked Texas Ranger in the American Old West, and his clever, taciturn native Indian sidekick Tonto, and Big John and Sparky, a daily 15-minute children's show hosted by John Arthur and his puppet Sparky.
Party with Big John and Sparky.
The puppet would not be the only Sparky in Ted's life. Young Ted at this point still hopes to be adopted, but this time by Roy Rogers, a popular singer and actor in Western movies whose life must be way more exciting than Ted's in his childlike eyes.
From San Francisco, here is the morning news with Bob Dunn.
Somewhat prematurely, a 9-year-old Ted also begins listening into KGO in San Francisco, a late-night radio talk show. He learns a lot about how different people talk, providing him with the intimacy that he believes to lack with others. He feels as if he's eavesdropping on their conversations, and the first signs of a peculiar preoccupation with other people's secret lives begin to show. He hunts down all radio bands for talk shows, call-in programs, and documentary-like shows. He'd take to formulating questions out loud as if the guests on air were talking to him personally. This pretend world of the night finally gives him a sense of peace he's been looking after. He's part of the conversation, and if he isn't, well, he can make himself think he is. Remember, nothing is, and what isn't can always be while also never being. As long as he doesn't talk about the great pleasure he gets out of his radio world, it never happened. Gradually, the emptiness he feels, that uneasy feeling, is lulled by this extensive daydreaming and the identities he creates inspired by the personalities he hears. The facility with which he develops the ability to imitate accents, imagine himself in fascinating backstories, and make himself a part of a parallel reality deeply affects his personality and will become factors which will forever impact his mental state and decision-making throughout the rest of his life. In the real world, however, in the meantime, it's 1956. Most people use the radio to listen to Elvis's Heartbreak Hotel, and Ted's third sister Sandy is born. By now, Louise is a veteran mother and comes armed with her share of courtesy and determination at every PTO conference she attends. She already knows what the teachers think about Ted and how to soften them up. She's got a bright kid who gets himself in the occasional scuffle, so school staff appreciate her involvement and hard work to make up for the fact that the family doesn't have a lot of money. According to her, it's this involvement that inspires Ted to develop a desire to get involved in politics at an early age. But we'll see this has quite a different effect on him. As a matter of fact, Ted is actually becoming more conscious of all the differences between his family and the wealthier kids at school, the ones with the swimming pools and all. Despite standing firmly at middle class, by the standards of the local school district, the Bundys are basically poor. At age 10, Ted makes his first attempt to mitigate his financial inferiority complex and enter an inner circle through reading participation, but his skill level is not enough to place him in the club, courtesy of the infamous mild speech impediment he's attempting to cure via radiotherapy. Despite this, he continues to be an avid reader when alone and begins to develop a fascination with murder mystery stories in particular. I know what you're thinking. We'll get there. The 4th grade is also when something else equally shady happens. Ted becomes fond of a new teacher, the pleasant Mrs. Ryan, a voluptuous disciplinarian who treats him well and takes an interest in his education. The psychiatrist would hear Ted describe the woman raised a brow. It is pretty uncommon for adults to attribute sexual concepts to other adults they're seeing as children. Potentially, Ted's expertise in the pornographic arena is starting to show. At this point, Louise starts locking the doors when Ted's sister Linda is taking a bath, and, well, we can't exactly blame her. By the 5th grade, Ted has a new teacher, once again. She is German and very competent, and he sees her as more of a teacher than a caretaker for the first time. This distinction is important because it helps Ted develop an appreciation for education himself, and for history in particular. And it will be through his study of history that Ted develops an interest in politics. This contributes to a general improvement of his grades and performance in class. One of his teachers from around his time will describe him as neither one of the good ones or the bad ones, just a happy, well-adjusted child always eager to learn. On the other hand, years later, Seattle police would come to different conclusions about Ted in the 5th grade, claiming that he acts babyish and mischievous, eager to show off by doing extra work but not appreciating being singled out for discipline. But then again, who does? He often passes off his work as better than it actually is, giving off the impression that it's superior in some shape or form, without really putting in much effort in the actual work itself. His character was such that he was too good for any sort of discipline, the same report states. Puberty would soon make this latter trait more readily apparent. Ted starts middle school at Hunt Junior High School. His teachers seem to be continuing to take similar renowned interests in him, which allows him to further build his confidence. He'll become known for his ability to sell Christmas lights around the neighborhood. Apparently, this was a thing. He tries his hand at team sports and begins playing football after school, but in the end doesn't really like it. He finds practice a long, sweaty, and dirty affair and the whole ordeal too serious. Of course, there's also the fact that he wasn't good at it, which he blamed on his stepfather who never played any ball-ending sports with him that could allow him to be properly trained and doesn't bother to attend the games, and Louise, who doesn't like him being on the team because it's too expensive. Still, Ted is able to make some friends and socialize. He sits behind a kid named Jerry Balat during his homeroom class, and the two become friends out of their shared love for night skiing. Potentially, this is the adventuresome kid he mentions he will try to exchange comic books for a pocket knife with. Either comic books or something else. Apparently one day, Ted takes Balat aside at school and shows him a photo of a man and a woman having oral sex. Balat is shocked. Ted claims to have found it on the sidewalk, but Sandy Holt claims he discovered it at her father's. By Ted's own accord, he'd rummage through the trash in search for porn. Just like what he'd found at Grandpa Sam's greenhouse, here he was again, tempted by thrills he could experience in the comforts of his own lonesome. Initially, it does appear to be harmless. According to Ted,
it sort of manifests itself as an interest concerning sexual behavior, sexual images. It might simply be a host of other normal, healthy sexual stimuli that are found in the environment.
At 12, most of his spank bank material is pretty commonplace for a preteen. Photos of women in skin magazines, suntan product ads, jiggly starlets on TV. The sight of a woman's body on provocative display is particularly entrancing for young Ted. And the occasional Playboy, which Louise would one day find tucked under his bed and never confront him about, as was the custom. But while his peers would go on to focus their inexperienced energies in attempting to actually touch a woman, Ted remained content living in his world of fantasy where he could control what the objects of his desire would do without fear of an actual reprieve. While this is happening, Ted becomes the vice president of the local Methodist Youth Fellowship, which seems appropriate, of course. Despite the big influence of Christianity in the home, Ted doesn't develop a strong religious bond with God. It seems to be that his fondness for the activity is centered around holding one of his first and only positions of power and having the ability to socialize with other kids. Over the summer, Ted attends church and joins the church basketball team, which he likes far more than football. Later efforts in this field will not prove as memorable. So, at this point, I have to address something that everyone knows or thinks they know about Ted at this age. The infamous broom closet rumor. So rumor has it that Ted is caught masturbating by kids in the broom closet at school, and they threw cups of cold water at him and teased him to no end about it. Ted obviously denied this ever happened. I have no doubts that the teasing did indeed occur, but it is far more likely that what actually happened is that shy Ted preferred showering alone in the private stall after PE. The other kids at this point probably jokingly said he liked to do this because he wanted to masturbate and then proceeded to throw cold water over him. At least I hope. Or I don't. I don't know what the correct version of the events should be. He ends up wet, cold, and humiliated in both. That's fine by me. There is also another rumor about Ted. This one involves him carrying dry dog food in his pocket to snack on. I'll let you make up your mind on that one. As the 50s come to a close, there doesn't seem to be a more wholesome, apolitical, almost sitcom-esque family as the Bundy bunch. Family activities around this time include, obviously, church, weekend camping, visiting relatives, either Uncle Jack in the Olympic Peninsula for a couple of weeks in the summertime or the Cowell clan in the East Coast on at least 4 different occasions, celebrating birthdays with friends, reading and discussing books, and listening to lively music together. Neither Ted nor Johnny nor Louise smoke or drink, and they remain quite frugal. Louise would go on to say about her parenting of Ted,
"We did everything parents in the 50s and 60s did. I wouldn't say that if he had been a problem child or constantly misbehaving."
Which is considerably less emphatic than another earlier statement she'd made describing her son during this time.
"There has never been a child or young man anywhere more beloved and admired by his family than our Ted. No parents had ever had a better son, and brothers and sisters a better brother."
I guess we can see where Ted gets his gift for hyperbolic contradictions. This statement, which was written in a letter to vouch for Ted's character during a legal battle, appears at direct odds with her claim that her parenting skills were limited to what was usual at the time. But for now, this seems to be at least somewhat true. Save for the occasional conflict, the family life at the Bundy house appears to be quite normal and serene. Still, the deified, idealized description of his upbringing would go on to become an important part of how Ted came to see his past. Louise, as time will tell, might have been aware that things were not that dreamy. One thing's for certain, the family vacation and fun activities would rarely be brought up by Louise's doting son, unless an interviewer would go on to ask, or he was sitting in a prison cell, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The truth is, around this time, Louise notices that despite her best efforts, Ted has one thing on his mind, and it's neither sex nor murder, it's things. By his passing comments, she deduces that Ted wishes his family to be far wealthier than they are. How come to the other kids he knows have so much more than them when she works so hard? Things get worse when Johnny buys his family a new ride, a 1959 Nash Rambler. Instead of being excited about having a new state-of-the-art pair of wheels, Ted despises the car so much he feels humiliated to be seen in it. Material possessions start acquiring a special importance in his life. This is about the time he starts casually pulling clothes off of expensive racks and longing for the finer things in life. If he wants something, he'll go out and get it. It's like a hunt. In 8th grade, Ted runs for school vice president and loses. Vice president of junior high school loss. Let that sink in for a second. It is devastating. From this point onward, he'd limit his participation in student government to advising potential candidates and would not run again himself. He also still has occasional temper problems, even if they rarely show. During playful fights, his former classmates would say that his eyes would take on a deranged, wild quality. The dazed stare is still there. But the older Ted would get, the more he'd be able to control, hold back, and quell his inner anger, and no one would have guessed this would have been the most dangerous development of the story yet. Loneliness is not a disease of being alone, but of not knowing one's place in the world. I know you've been waiting for this. When does it truly begin? Does it? Well, I think it's pretty clearly underway, but age 13 in a way is a turning point for Ted, and a certain incident he's been linked to since the beginning of the widespread publicity of his case. So, let's start to actually unpack what set this bastard on the road for irreversible downfall. Ted begins high school in the fall of 1960 and works a number of jobs to contribute to his budding desire for independence. He's a newspaper delivery boy on a 78 customer route, a bowling alley assistant, and somehow has already convinced a few other friends to join his growing lawn care business, cutting neighbors' grass. Despite this industriousness, he's somewhat traumatized, his words, not mine, over not getting chosen for various team sports, because he's still a little smaller than his peers. He has minor success in track, reaching the 3rd place in several races. He also manages to play in the sweaty, dirty football team as a wide receiver or halfback. Wait, you might ask yourself, didn't he hate it? See, but that's not what matters. What matters is for him to fit in, to prove to others that he can. There's only one thing Ted truly enjoys, but we'll get there. He needs time to figure that out. His mother, Louise, once again, would later boast about Ted's success in basketball and football along with track, despite that not being exactly the case. Louise has her own sense of delusions. She feels Ted is special and that out of her children, he is the one with the most potential. She already established her tendency to exaggerate his accomplishments, inflate his perceived popularity, and fabricate many of their shared moments together. It is unclear whether Ted lied to her, making her believe that he was far more successful than what reality would reveal, if he had actually minimized his activities during his formative years and Louise was telling the truth, or if she would later lie in order to attempt to strengthen credibility for his innocence, or simply protect her choices for his upbringing as a mother. Any one of them could be possible. But let me show you what I mean. For example, around this time, Louise would believe Ted to be profoundly intellectually gifted, getting straight A's, making the honor roll, the works. In reality, he averages B's. But because he appreciates the formalized setting of school and takes every chance to speak up and participate in class, he cultivates this serious-minded scholarly image.
Hi, this is Johnny Carson. As you know, this is usual starting time for The Tonight Show.
Even more bizarre is Louise's later claim that the two of them had a special relationship and would stay up late at night to talk with each other even after Johnny went to bed, discussing anything, from current events to the state of the national government. Later on, the two of them would even have particularly serious arguments about the failure of the church to take a stand against the war in Vietnam. Yet Ted would later state the exact opposite, that the two of them wouldn't talk about real personal matters at all. While Louise would help him type up papers as he dictated, and he credits her with his excellent verbal skills, he'd also quite literally say that she'd never said anything besides the occasional,
"I love you, I'm sorry we haven't written, everything's fine, blah blah blah."
Again, his words, not mine. He'd speculate that there was something in her background that prevented her from opening up to him, a logjam of feeling in her, as he'd call it, that she never explained. He remembered learning about her achievements, but never her childhood. Most importantly, despite her involvement in the church and the PTO, Louise was not a socializing type person in Ted's eyes. She did it because she had to. He'd say,
"She has a great deal of potential, but then at a point it seems she shied away."
Change that pronoun and you'll find the words to this effect being spoken by numerous characters in her story about Ted. Like mother, like son. Speaking of things that the two of them don't talk about, after some previous kissing with the girls and sexual touching here and there in junior high school, by high school, Ted discontinues dating altogether without an explanation. He claims he was never able to tell if a girl liked him or not, which presumably means he never took the plunge out of a very normal fear of rejection. Okay, fair enough. He says he does manage a couple of dates and parties with the socially adept. Notice the distinction, he doesn't see himself as one of them. According to Louise, here we go again, he did in fact date, as girls were always calling him. It's just that he didn't solo date often. He was invited to parties a lot, and she knew for a fact because she and Johnny took it upon themselves to drive not only Ted, but all his friends along in what she referred to as a
Taxi service.
Ted felt otherwise, and despite being articulate, charming, and generally likable, he claims,
"I'm particularly dense or insensitive, not knowing when a woman's interested in me. I've been described as handsome and all that shit or attractive. I don't believe it. It's a built-in insecurity."
What's interesting is that since a young age, Ted seems to have had quite an effect on women who find him exceedingly charismatic. For the most part, or at least early on, his excellent verbal skills appear to be his greatest asset in attracting them. A lot of female and possibly male, I don't discriminate, childhood and teenage acquaintances had a crush on him. It's almost as if something disables their rational brain when in his presence. They let their guard down, and he will learn to exploit that. When later asked about this interruption of his romantic life by a psychologist, Ted plays dumb and says,
"Gee, I don't know what it could have been."
It's clear that he has something to hide about what's going on. Even the shrink, the very proficient Dr. Al Carlisle, who we'll talk about later, notices the hesitancy, a hesitancy he otherwise never displayed. But we know what's going on. Remember, he has an inner world to tend to, like his own personal greenhouse garden. The truth is, Ted's been doing his murdery mystery reading, his strolling around during warm nights. Sometimes he looks out of his bedroom window into a neighbor's bathroom, and sometimes he would take off his clothes and run around the woods as an innocent kind of sport. In fact, Ted is probably much more familiar with sex than he lets on. I think I'm repeating myself since this is the kid who found the naked lady stash at the age of 4. He may have had a confused idea about it, but plenty of desire, channeled into fantasies which he didn't have the confidence or the experience to express. Energy that turns back into itself. His total absorption leads him to dissociate even more strongly to what is going on around him. He'd say,
"I was out of touch. I spent a lot of time with myself. I would fantasize about coming up to some girl sunbathing in the woods or something innocuous like that. It was basically voyeuristic. Because I was totally on my own and wasn't sharing this with anybody, nobody could say, 'Gee, that's weird, don't do that.'"
He knows that his focus on pornography is a vicarious way to experience what his peers must be enjoying in reality. The reality he's too dense for. Yeah, right. What's really going on is that he knows that what turns him on is a little out there, so he begins showing a preference for autoerotic sexual activity. He's probably been masturbating to the hard pornography he's been seeking since his first exposure when he was very young. Seriously, take a shot every time I say that. Ugh. The strong emotional and physical release probably induces him to seek increasingly deviant materials for the thrill of it. He'd later describe his shift in sexual interests as
for some reason becoming geared towards matters of a sexual nature that involve violence, getting sucked into the more sinister doctrines, the use, the abuse, the possession of women as objects. I cannot emphasize enough the gradual development of this. It is not short term. There is some kind of weakness that gives rise to the individual's interest in the kind of sexual activity involving violence that would gradually begin to absorb some of this fantasy.
For Ted, possession was not just physical. He wished to have women mentally, metaphorically, and spiritually too. The unknown reason may have something to do with Sam's significantly more hardcore collection, always taking him back to his idyllic days in Philadelphia. Ted said it himself that, according to his view of the world,
we're 95% of the way we are because of the way we were raised and where we were raised.
Grandpa Sam was a man Ted sought to emulate, and this could mean appreciating the same material he'd been exposed to for the very first time. Another shot. For his entire life, in fact, Ted would search for the same feeling he had when he first laid eyes on the most taboo image he'd seen yet. It happens by chance, as he'd say.
These chance happenings, those offerings that are out there in the environment, we can say why a person might find them in most cases very attractive. He just does.
He also discovers a passion for salacious detective magazines filled with crime stories, which he already likes, now accompanied by pictures and illustrations of frightened women and on occasion dead female bodies, scantily clad, of course. He absorbs the material with remarkable ease, which would go on to form the base of his extensive knowledge on criminal techniques. And so, just like that, two words collide. Two of the worlds he'd immersed himself in to escape his tired Tacoma days melt into one another to create another striking existence. Sex and violence become one. But when he realizes the wider implications of his preferences, something goes wrong. Initially, he'd find himself bringing home pornographic books, reading them, and then shredding them in anger, self-disgust, and fear of discovery. But the thrill of reading about the forbidding violence and occasionally getting a chance to see it prevails over any temporary melancholy. After all, it's not like he's the actor in these fantasies he's so fascinated by, just a voyeur who finds gratification from reading the material. The X-rated movies and more violent police dramas replace Mr. Rogers as his go-to escapist fantasy. While some kids drink or watch TV, Ted indulges in noticing both illicit and graphic forms of pornography in print or film. He finds himself exploring dirty local bookstores to find materials that cater to his desires. But as he gets more and more sucked in, the specificity of his perversity calls for riskier research. As he'd say,
I always sought out the stories where the guy confessed. I wanted first-hand stuff. I didn't want the police version. The best articles always had crime scene photos. That's what I went for. I became something of a connoisseur of these kinds of photos, and I knew where to get the pictures of crime scene photographs into medical school libraries, and especially photographs of autopsies and crime scenes involving young women who had been murdered.
It's all very gross, and he knows it. The only problem is that, well, he still has a life, and it is this life that he blames. It is the so-called real world, the one in which his body is still firmly lodged in, that with every passing day of anger, frustration, rejection, repression, whatever, continues to motivate and intensify his anger and emptiness, which in turn fuel the voyeuristic violent fantasies, the hole inside that needs to be filled. But when the ritual is over, the feelings remain. All he can do is look forward to the next moment when he might be able to engage in something that will bridge the gap between reality and fantasy. Eventually, the desire for new material is so pervasive that Ted knows he can only fulfill it by visiting the dingiest of dirty bookstores. Deep down, Ted is once again living vicariously through the perps he fanboys over. The human hunters who got women to surrender at their behest, completely dominated under their control of a powerful male figure, forced under escalating threats of abhorrent violence to follow his every demand. Utter, infinite control. The more he seeks, sees, and finds it, the less of an effect it will have on him. The desensitization of Ted Bundy's inner moral compass at the age of 13 has begun. But he can't be engaging in autoerotic activity in the broom closet, wait, nope, not that one, all the time. He needs something else to do, so he finds solace in skiing. It's fun, and it allows him to find a social circle while heading up to Crystal Mountain on holidays and weekends. On occasion, he fixes up his own skis, the old wooden ones, putting the base and waxing them. One of Ted's hobbies at around this time is going to dumps, places where people discard various items like clothing, paperboards, boxes, furniture, etc., which would have helped him him with his restoration projects. However, he quickly realizes there's an even better way to get equipment, finer equipment at that. So Ted begins stealing all of his expensive modern skis and proudly masterminds a crude forgery scheme by bleaching and dyeing color-coded ski lift passes to save money and get into the slopes for free. Apparently, one of the kids in on this is the president of the student body whose campaign Ted had unofficially ran, and a bunch of other honor roll kids. They're not just a couple of thugs. No, he sees his posse as bona fide white-collar criminals. This is the first time that Ted would knowingly break the law. If he's proud of this one instance of circumventing the system, who's to say he won't grow even more satisfied at getting away with riskier and riskier behavior as time goes on? With so much stuff out there, why shouldn't he have some of it? Who would miss it? This is the mindset Ted Bundy would begin to operate under, crafting a whole life philosophy centered around fulfilling his innermost desires, which society had deprived him of at the expense of others. In a fantasy world, this makes sense because none of this is real anyway. Neither is his own name. Unfortunately, this still doesn't manage to get him invited to the numerous parties held by his classmates after they'd hit the slopes. Of course, Louise is convinced her son is the life of the party and spends plenty of time skiing and swimming whenever he could with a whole entourage of friends. The fancy skis?
Probably just gifts from the department store.
Despite his stints in team sports, attempts at student government, and occasional boring double dates, Ted would later claim that friends just had become less important during this period. Was this a defense mechanism to justify his lack of success in social endeavors? Who knows? An anonymous young woman from Wilson High School in Tacoma who spends her evenings on the local kids' porches chit-chatting about their days would later get in touch with Carlisle, the psychologist I swear he matters, to reveal her insights on teenage Ted. He seems like a level-headed guy and highly intelligent. She does recall his lack of female companionship, though. His tendency to be shy around strangers, but outgoing with his friends. His attendance of all local games, but never a single dance. His lack of negative impression, but not a great one either. Bullying? No, not really. He's just busy doing his thing in his house. He's a friendly person, but he doesn't seem to stand out in any way. And maybe, just maybe, this is exactly how he wanted it to be. 1961 starts with the birth of Ted's youngest and most beloved brother, Richard or Rich Bundy. Ted becomes the closest to him as he feels a sort of paternal relationship with little Rich. Ted is busy doing his thing around the house. As the oldest, he's in charge of all the babysitting and misses out on activities to do so. Not that he necessarily minds. Louise would later claim that
All of his siblings looked up to their older brother, partly because of the large age gaps.
he was the most responsible of all her children and would always tell her where he was. Obviously, something was changing, but it's not like Louise can see the damage. And if she could, she wouldn't talk about it. Not a chance. But by summer, something is amiss. And Ted knows, as he'd say,
Nothing I can recall happened that summer before my sophomore year to stunt me or otherwise hinder my progress, but I got to high school and I didn't make any progress. Something happened. I'm not sure what it was.
something does happen that summer. Anne-Marie Burr, an 8-year-old girl who lived somewhat close to Ted's, is abducted. After putting her to bed on a night in June, in the early hours of the morning, her parents find her gone and the bedroom window wide open. A massive manhunt begins the next day, but all that is left of Anne is a size 6 shoe print near her house. A house which, according to some sources, was said to be on Ted's paper route, despite being on the opposite side of town, by the way, and obviously he'd later refute all of this. Ted would become a lifelong suspect in her disappearance, but his involvement has never been conclusively proven. He'd claimed that he didn't know anything about the case at the time and that he was
So involved in his school activities, he didn't pay much attention to it.
This is not a convincing denial for many of the detectives and investigators who would later have the harrowing task of attempting to name Ted's first murder. But we'll have time to go over all of that. For now, suffice to say that in 1987, Ted would imply to an investigator, Ron M. Holmes, we'll meet him too, that he was indeed responsible. However, considering the story that unfolds between Ted and Holmes, there is no way to verify that this is true. You'll see what I mean. Later, when describing his feelings when killing, Ted would say in his third-person mode so as not to incriminate himself.
When he's 15, taking a life would be much more mystical, exciting, intense, overwhelming of an experience than...
Sure, he might have picked the age of 15 casually, and he was 14 when Anne-Marie went missing, but why go so far back in time to describe the first kill? And in case you don't know this, Ted spoke in the third person often to talk about his crimes while he was on appeal so that he wouldn't incriminate himself. Partly. Kind of. Maybe. We'll also talk about this later. Let's settle on more often than not. In 2015, Ted's DNA was tested and compared to a series of small samples taken from the Burr home at the time, including the stained wood inside the edge of the windowsill left open that night, stained wood in the window ledge, scrapings outside the sill, and scrapings from the head of the bed. They attempted to compare the apparent red-brown stains against a sample of Ted's blood, but it turns out they didn't contain any blood at all, so the test remains inconclusive to this day. Back in 1962, the last year we'll cover for this episode, Ted's perplexing arrested social development catches up to him. There's no sense of maturation of emotions or growing rationalization of adult morality, and he begins feeling increasingly out of place in society as a result. It was not so much that there were significant events, it's their lack thereof that is significant. Despite the forgery ring and the track team and the constant raising hand in class, Ted isn't tremendously popular. He feels alienated from his friends as they move into the broader spheres and he doesn't. Warren Dodge, who I told you shared Ted's birthday, so by all accounts should be astrologically comparable, right? Says his friend is doing fine. He's intelligent, shy, not aggressive. There's nothing wrong per se. But when other friends would ask his other buddy, Terry Storwick, to outings in front of Ted without extending the invitation, Storwick recalls him being very sensitive to this. Still, Ted is able to be bright and amusing and wonderfully subtle, and genuinely funny despite being tongue-tied in social situations. He puts up a front of being a serious student who's above his social life, but realizes this is a way to defend himself against something he doesn't want to admit he deeply desires. He believes people perceive him as being aloof, arrogant, and snobby. Again, another way to protect himself from achieving the kinds of social goals he wants. He doesn't have the social skills or the motivation to join clubs, and the popular gregarious kids intimidate him. Here we see the worst signs of a warped self-perception begin to form. By now, he's completely surrendered to his own inner world, and we know what's happening there. The real world is not exactly a source of happiness, so there is no need to seek it out, and this disturbs the regular maturation process. Living in the fantasies means staying a child forever, to an extent. Social antics and consequences of actions are either disregarded or deemed incomprehensible. Other kids are moving on and he isn't. Ted hit a wall in high school, and the problem is just about to begin. The sociopath is born. And he isn't a suave, smooth operator. He needs a motivation to learn to be one. Initially, he's just clueless.
I didn't know what made things tick. I didn't know what made people want to be friends. I didn't know what made people attractive to one another. I didn't know what underlay social interactions. I didn't adapt to the broader social schemes. I restricted myself to my friends in the neighborhood. At times, I felt left out as my friends went off in other directions. I felt apprehension toward establishing new relationships.
Numerous psychiatrists would later suggest, in another theory, socio-emotional learning disorder, SELD, as a possible cause for these symptoms. It could certainly match with his own feeling that
somewhere in the chemical finery of the brain something went wrong, temporary or permanent,
as he'd say. But I'm not here to diagnose anyone, just to call them bastards. So, to counteract this, what does Ted do? He gets involved in politics. Not only do you not have to have an actual soul for it, but it gives him a sense of class, feeding his desire to move among affluent and respected people in the formal communication structures he can function in. He could be in control. Great Aunt Jenny would later pinpoint this as the starting place in Ted's metamorphosis. She noticed there was something wrong with him as he went from the nice, sweet boy she remembered to a Nixon Republican. Is she wrong though? He delivers a Rockefeller nomination speech at a mock GOP convention and proudly declares Arkansas Senator Fulbright, who'd go on to be the longest-serving chairman in the history of the United States Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, as one of his heroes. Politics is social relations formalized. Politics makes sense. Politics can teach him how to be. It gives him direction and allows him to move between what he calls the
various strata of society.
no more poor boy without a pool, politician instead. One of his political science teachers remembers him as highly motivated and curious in this regard, the kind of student that any teacher would like to have, but with the air of a concerned scholar that appears most unusual for the kids in high school around him. But Ted is no ordinary kid. Radio and politics give him people he can model himself after, and they'll be a fundamental help in crafting what he thinks is the right persona to move into adulthood superficially. Bits and pieces of a persona, that is, because Ted is stuck there, acquiring, stealing, collecting, possessing, controlling all the moving parts, but never able to put them together into something real, because nothing is. He plays a role on stage. He goes out and lives his part, feels his part, talks his part, and slowly but surely, even his voice will conform to the new role that he's playing. The speech impediment business is over. Something is starting to happen, and he can't put a finger on what's going on exactly, but in time, he'll realize that he's but at the early stages of a dramatic change in his personality. The early stages of what is a tragedy that is very, very much real. Next on The Bastard, the Peeping Prince, we'll take a closer look at Ted's troubled college years as he wanders around menial jobs, experiences a life-changing relationship. And I'm not talking about his life necessarily here. And we'll see the inner workings of his mind shift from passive fantasy fiend to yacht club busboy with a fake mustache, ready and willing to abduct the first lady in sight. If you're still with us, thank you so much for making it this far. This episode is dedicated in loving memory of Louise Cowell and Johnny Bundy, as well as Ted's brother Rich, who is still alive. I'd like to personally thank all the researchers, writers, legal assistants, psychologists, and archivists who have made all the information to compile each episode of this podcast possible. I'd like to thank Tiffany Jean in particular, who runs the Killer in the Archives blog and Patreon, for her help in providing feedback on the information contained in this episode. My mission is to provide as much of a nuanced, detailed, and accurate account of the events to challenge the narratives that we're used to in the true crime community. And I wouldn't be able to do that without accurate fact-checking. You can find all the sources in the show notes and on the website, along with scripts for each of the episodes. We'll see you at the next show, if you're still there.